Stop pulling those weeds every weekend. If they keep coming back, the problem may not be your effort. It may be what you're leaving behind in the soil. And before you spend another dollar on expensive weed products, there's a simple $2 lawn trick worth knowing. In this video, you'll learn why repeatedly pulling weeds can leave you fighting the same battle, how this inexpensive method works, and where it makes sense to use it without damaging the grass you actually want. Stay with me, because the most important step happens before you apply anything. And if you want smarter lawn care shortcuts, subscribe. You pull the weed, see the roots come out, and assume the problem is finished. A few days later, another green shoot appears in almost the exact same spot. That cycle is frustrating because you're removing what you can see without necessarily changing the conditions that allowed the weed to establish there. Some weeds are especially persistent because their underground growth can survive after the visible portion is removed. If even part of the root system remains, the plant may have enough stored energy to produce new growth. Pulling also leaves behind a small opening in the turf, and that exposed space can become an invitation for another weed seed to germinate. The lawn itself plays a bigger role than most people realize. Dense, actively growing grass leaves fewer empty spaces where weeds can establish. Thin turf does the opposite. When grass coverage declines because of drought, poor mowing, compaction, shade, or heavy traffic, sunlight reaches the soil surface more easily. Weed seeds that were already present suddenly have an opportunity to compete. That creates an important distinction between removing a weed and reducing weed pressure. Pulling can deal with an individual plant, but it doesn't automatically improve the lawn around it. If the same conditions remain, you can keep removing weeds week after week without making meaningful progress. Soil disturbance can add another complication. Digging aggressively around every weed may bring buried seeds closer to the surface, where moisture and sunlight can trigger germination. You may remove today's weed while creating a better opportunity for tomorrow's. The timing of your response matters too. A tiny weed caught early is generally easier to manage than a mature plant that has already developed a larger root system or produced seeds. That's why simply waiting until weeds become obvious enough to pull can turn a small problem into a recurring chore. The $2 trick we're about to discuss takes a different approach. Instead of treating every weed as an isolated target, it focuses on using the right method for the specific situation while protecting the surrounding lawn. But there's an important detail you need to understand before trying it. The ingredient isn't automatically the solution just because it costs only $2. Used incorrectly, even a cheap lawn treatment can create problems of its own. Before reaching for the $2 ingredient, there's one distinction that can save you from making the wrong treatment. A lawn weed isn't automatically a problem that needs a homemade mixture. The method only makes sense when the target, timing, and surrounding grass are suitable for it. The inexpensive ingredient we'll focus on is white vinegar. Vinegar contains acetic acid, and that acid can damage the leaves and tissues of plants it contacts. That's why the application needs to be targeted. When the solution reaches a weed's foliage, it can disrupt the plant tissue exposed to the treatment, causing the leaves to dry, wilt, and lose their healthy appearance. That sounds straightforward, but there's a catch. Vinegar isn't selective in the way a grass-safe herbicide can be. If the spray lands on desirable grass, flowers, or other plants, those tissues can also be damaged. The same property that makes vinegar useful against unwanted vegetation is exactly why careless application can create a second problem in your lawn. Concentration also matters. A stronger solution isn't automatically a smarter solution. Increasing the concentration can increase the potential for plant injury, but it doesn't magically turn vinegar into a selective weed killer. More aggressive isn't always more effective when your goal is to remove weeds while preserving the turf around them. The type of weed matters too. Young, small weeds with limited foliage may react differently from mature perennial weeds with established underground structures. A treatment that damages the visible leaves doesn't necessarily guarantee that a deep-rooted perennial will never return. Some plants have enough underground reserves to produce fresh growth after the top portion has been injured. That changes how you should think about this $2 trick. It's better viewed as a targeted contact treatment for suitable situations, not a universal replacement for every weed control method. The goal is to deal with the unwanted plant while minimizing disturbance to the lawn and avoiding unnecessary applications. Weather can influence the outcome as well. Rain shortly after application can reduce contact with the foliage, while windy conditions can carry droplets onto plants you never intended to treat. Choosing calm, suitable conditions gives you better control over where the solution lands. And there's one more rule worth remembering. Never assume that because an ingredient is inexpensive or common around the house, every concentration or mixture is automatically safe for your lawn. The next step is where the difference between a useful trick and a damaged lawn becomes clear: how you apply a contact treatment without turning the surrounding grass into collateral damage. Before you mix anything, identify exactly what you're trying to treat. Walk around the affected area and separate the weeds from the grass you want to keep. A few isolated weeds are a very different situation from a lawn covered in unwanted plants, and that distinction determines whether a targeted approach makes sense. Choose a calm, dry period for the application. Wind can move fine droplets away from the weed and onto nearby grass, flowers, shrubs, or garden plants. Rain can also interfere with a contact treatment by washing it away before the foliage has had enough time to remain exposed. Check the weather first rather than treating simply because the weeds are visible. Application technique matters more than covering a large area. The objective is to wet the unwanted foliage without soaking the surrounding lawn. A small hand sprayer gives you much more control around isolated weeds than a broad application across the entire yard. Keep the spray directed toward the target and avoid creating a fine mist that can drift onto desirable plants. Protect nearby plants before you begin. If a weed is growing directly inside a healthy patch of grass, the margin for error is small. You may be better off removing that individual plant manually than risking contact with the surrounding turf. The cheapest treatment isn't a bargain if it creates a larger repair job afterward. Don't increase the concentration just because the first application seems slow. Contact treatments can take time to show visible damage, and different weeds can respond at different rates. Applying more product immediately can increase the chance of damaging plants you intended to protect without necessarily improving the final result. Keep the treatment focused on actively growing weeds. A completely dried out plant has little healthy foliage available for a contact treatment to affect. Likewise, a mature perennial weed may recover from damage to its leaves because its underground structures remain alive. Knowing what you're looking at helps you decide whether this method is appropriate in the first place. Follow the directions and safety information for any product you use. If you're using a commercial vinegar-based herbicide rather than household vinegar, the product label determines the permitted application, concentration, protective equipment, and approved uses. Don't assume that a stronger homemade mixture is equivalent to a labeled herbicide. After treatment, leave the area alone long enough to judge the response. Look for changes in the treated foliage rather than expecting the entire lawn to transform overnight. If the weed survives and begins producing fresh growth, don't automatically keep increasing the application. That response may indicate that you're dealing with a plant that requires a different control strategy. Most importantly, don't turn a targeted treatment into a blanket lawn spray. The trick works best when you're precise about where it goes, what you're treating, and what you're trying to protect. The next question is just as important. Which lawn situations actually make this approach worthwhile, and when should you skip it altogether? A small weed problem is where a targeted approach makes the most sense. Imagine 3 or 4 young weeds appearing along a sidewalk edge, beside a driveway, or in a small gap where you can clearly separate the unwanted plants from the turf. Those are situations where precision is possible and the risk to desirable grass is easier to control. Thin areas need more thought. If weeds are appearing throughout a weak section of lawn, the visible plants may only be part of the problem. Poor turf density leaves open space for weeds to establish, so treating individual plants without improving the surrounding grass can turn into a repeating cycle. In that situation, correcting the lawn's growing conditions matters just as much as dealing with the weeds already present. Sunlight changes the picture as well. A sunny patch with actively growing turf may respond differently from a shaded area where grass naturally struggles to compete. Before treating a weed, look at the surrounding vegetation. If grass consistently fails in that location because of heavy shade, excess moisture, or another environmental limitation, Removing the weeds won't solve the reason they keep finding that space available. Young lawns deserve extra caution. Freshly seeded grass and newly established turf have little room for mistakes. When desirable grass is still developing, a drifting spray or accidental contact can create damage in exactly the area you're trying to build. Manual removal may be the better option when the weeds are isolated and the surrounding seedlings are particularly vulnerable. Established lawns offer more flexibility, but they aren't automatically safe. A mature lawn can still contain sensitive grass species, ornamental plants, or mixed vegetation around its edges. Identify the turf before treating anything, and never assume that a method suitable for one lawn will behave identically on another. Some weeds also deserve a different strategy. Annual weeds with shallow roots can be easier to manage when they're young. Deep-rooted perennial weeds can be much more persistent because damaging the foliage doesn't necessarily eliminate the underground plant. If the same weed repeatedly returns from the same location, continuing to treat the leaves may not address the real source of the problem. Timing matters beyond the calendar. Active growth, dry foliage, calm weather, and suitable temperatures can all influence how a contact treatment performs. Applying something simply because it's a convenient weekend project doesn't guarantee a useful result. And there are situations where skipping the $2 trick is the smarter decision. If weeds have taken over most of the lawn, if desirable plants are tightly mixed with them, or if you're unsure what species you're dealing with, a blanket homemade treatment can create more problems than it solves. Identification and a lawn-specific control strategy may be more appropriate. The best use of an inexpensive treatment isn't finding the largest area you can cover. It's finding the smallest area where you can control the target accurately without sacrificing the grass around it. And even then, a few common mistakes can turn a reasonable approach into a frustrating waste of time. One of the easiest mistakes is treating every weed as if it were the same problem. A tiny annual weed growing beside a driveway doesn't require the same strategy as a mature perennial buried inside established turf. When you skip that distinction, you can spend more time treating the lawn without getting closer to a lasting solution. Application errors create another problem. Spraying too broadly increases the chance of contacting grass or nearby plants that you wanted to keep. A targeted treatment depends on control, so rushing across a large area defeats the main advantage of using a small, inexpensive method in the first place. Weather can also work against you. Wind may carry droplets beyond the target, while rain can remove the treatment before the foliage has enough exposure. Treating during unsuitable conditions doesn't necessarily mean the method itself failed. Sometimes the timing was the weak link. Then there's the temptation to use more. Seeing little change after one application can make you think a stronger mixture will solve everything. That approach can increase plant damage without addressing why the weed survived. If the plant has a substantial underground root system, damaging its leaves may only produce temporary results. Repeated applications can become just as unhelpful. Give the treated area enough time to show a response before deciding what happens next. Constantly adding more product makes it harder to evaluate the outcome and can increase unnecessary exposure to the surrounding vegetation. Ignoring the lawn around the weed is another common mistake. Suppose a thin section contains dozens of weeds. Removing or treating those plants may improve the appearance temporarily, but open soil remains available for new weeds. Without improving turf density, you're repeatedly clearing the same space instead of making that space harder for weeds to occupy. Mowing can contribute to the cycle too. Cutting grass excessively short reduces the leaf area available for photosynthesis and can weaken the turf's ability to compete. A struggling lawn leaves more opportunities for unwanted plants to establish, so weed control should never be completely separated from basic grass care. Some homeowners also judge success too quickly. A weed looking wilted doesn't necessarily mean its entire root system is gone. Conversely, a healthy-looking lawn doesn't mean every weed problem has disappeared. Watch what happens over time and pay attention to whether new growth returns from the same plant or whether new seedlings are appearing elsewhere. Finally, don't confuse an inexpensive ingredient with a risk-free one. A $2 purchase can still be misused. Keep applications targeted, protect desirable plants, follow the directions of any labeled product you use, and choose a different control method when the situation falls outside what this approach can handle. The real savings come from knowing when the trick fits and when it doesn't. Once you stop treating every weed as an isolated emergency, you can put more attention toward the condition that determines how many weeds your lawn has to fight in the first place. A lawn with fewer weeds usually isn't the result of one perfect treatment. It comes from making the grass itself harder to invade. Once the immediate weed problem is under control, your attention should shift toward the conditions that determine whether those empty spaces stay open or become occupied again. Density is your first line of defense. When desirable grass fills the available space, fewer opportunities remain for weed seedlings to establish. That means thin areas shouldn't be ignored after the weeds disappear. Repairing bare spots, encouraging healthy growth, and keeping the turf evenly covered can reduce the number of new plants you have to deal with later. Mowing plays a surprisingly large role in that competition. Cutting too aggressively can leave grass stressed and reduce the amount of leaf surface available for photosynthesis. Maintaining the appropriate mowing height for your turf gives the plant more capacity to produce energy and recover from ordinary stress. A stronger canopy also helps shade the soil surface, making conditions less inviting for some emerging weeds. Watering deserves the same kind of attention. Frequent, shallow watering can encourage a lawn to depend heavily on moisture near the surface. A more thoughtful irrigation routine, adjusted for rainfall, soil type, temperature, and grass species, can support deeper root development. The goal isn't simply to water less. It's to provide moisture when the lawn actually needs it and avoid creating constantly wet conditions that can cause other problems. Nutrition should follow the condition of a lawn rather than the appearance of a weed. If the grass is hungry, correcting that deficiency can improve its ability to compete. If nutrients are already adequate, adding more won't automatically make the turf healthier. A soil test can be useful when the lawn repeatedly struggles despite reasonable care. Pay attention to the places where weeds keep returning. A recurring patch beside a driveway may be dealing with compaction. A weak area under a tree may be limited by shade. A constantly damp corner may have a drainage issue. Those locations are giving you clues, and fixing the environmental problem can be more effective than treating the same weeds every few weeks. Even small repairs can change the long-term picture. A thin strip along a walkway, a worn section near a gate, or a bare patch under outdoor equipment can become a permanent entry point for weeds if it remains exposed. Repair those areas when the growing conditions are suitable and the lawn has a much better chance of occupying the space itself. That is where the $2 trick fits into the bigger strategy. It can be useful for a limited, clearly identified weed problem, but it shouldn't become the foundation of your lawn care routine. Use targeted control when appropriate, then put your effort into growing turf that can compete on its own. The goal isn't to spend less money killing weeds every month. It's to create a lawn that gives weeds fewer places to start. Once that shift happens, weed control becomes an occasional maintenance task instead of the weekend chore you thought you'd never escape. Pulling every weed by hand can keep you busy without fixing why weeds keep returning. Use targeted control when it fits, then focus on building thicker, healthier turf. Watch the next video to discover the simple lawn care habit that can quietly create more weeds than you realize and how to fix it.